What is good, everybody? This is TAETRO. Welcome to my home studio. I'm very excited to present to you today the brand new Launchkey Mini Mark IV. Now, there's a lot of new things that come with the new versions of the launch keys. And you can see right off the bat, we actually have a new size for the Launchkey Mini, the Launchkey Mini 37. Let's walk through all the cool things that you can do with this new Launchkey Mini, and I'll give you my verdict on where this keyboard stands in the rankings of mini MIDI keyboards. Full disclosure that Novation did send me this unit for review. This is a pre-production unit, so it's not a mass-produced unit, but they don't have any say over what I'm saying in this video, and they are not the sponsor for today's video. Today's sponsor is DistroKid, which I'll tell you about later. Now, I don't like to just do talking here on the channel. I also like to take these things for a real spin. So enjoy this live looping performance, try to look for some cool features within that performance, and then we'll talk about those features right after. All right, I hope you enjoyed that live performance. A few new things to see there, but let's just dive right in to the features of the Launchkey Mini. Of course, at face value here, yes, we have a 37-key Launchkey Mini. That's new for this generation. We've also got this nice little screen, which will reflect different parameters as we go through the different modes of the Launchkey Mini. Button layout is slightly different from previous Launchkey Minis, and we're going to use all these buttons as we dig into the features. Let's do that right away, starting with these endless encoders. Pay attention to the small text text above the top row of pads. They say Encoder Mode. That means we can switch the mode of these encoders by holding Shift and tapping one of these pads. The first mode we have access to is Plugin Mode. Plugin Mode will control the devices on our screen. So you can see this piano I have here, this instrument rack in Ableton Live. I can adjust all the parameters of the macros of that instrument rack. If I go over to a track that has a few more devices in it, I can actually hold Shift and scroll through the different devices. As you can see, the blue hand moving around on screen. So I can select a different device to control with my encoders. Moving right along, we also have a mixer mode. And if you take a look at Ableton Live's screen here, you're going to see this kind of neon pink box. That represents what we're controlling with the Launchkey Mini. So you can see that I'm on track 3 here, the vocal track. I'm in mixer mode on the encoders. So this first encoder is going to be the volume for track 3, and then so on and so forth down the rest of the tracks. I can navigate around session view by holding Shift and pressing this arrow here. You can see track left and track right text here. And I can move up and down the session with these arrows, just not holding Shift. So that's how we navigate around session view, and how we use the mixer, with the encoders lining up with the volumes of each track. But we don't only have access over the levels, we can use this arrow key once again to change to panning. So now we're controlling the panning of the track. Move right along, we have access to our sends. If I press play here, you can hear I'm dialing in the reverb on this synth track, and that's for each track down the list as well. And then, you guessed it, use the arrow key here, and now we're adjusting send B. We're adding delay into that track. Pretty straightforward. Hold Shift and go into transport encoder mode, which is where the real fun begins. So this first encoder is actually a scrub encoder, which means, let's say I play through this loop. I can scroll through the position of this loop. It doesn't make sense in session view really, but if I tab over to arrangement view and use this encoder, you can see that I'm scanning around the arrangement. So very helpful if you're working in arrangement view. On the next encoder, we have a zoom, so we can zoom in and out of our session here in arrangement view. If I tab back over to session view, I can scan across my different tracks with this encoder. That is just a different way of navigating around. Remember, I can hold Shift and go to different tracks. I can also use this encoder and go to different tracks. And do notice that each track is being armed with that little red note at the bottom. The MIDI tracks, at least. That doesn't work for audio tracks, but those will be automatically armed as they get selected. Both ways of selecting the tracks. The next encoder here in session view is going to have us scrolling vertically through our scenes. That's very helpful if you're looking to launch scenes from this. But if I tab back over to the arrangement view, it does something actually pretty interesting. The track that you have selected, it will actually zoom it in. It'll change the size of that track. That's pretty cool. Staying in arrangement view here for a minute, let's zoom out a little bit. The next encoder, encoder 4, actually allows us to change our loop position. And we can change the loop end with the next encoder. The next encoder over is marker select. So if I had locators in here, let's just drop a couple in. I could use this encoder to jump between the different locators. And our final two encoders have no current assignment. And obviously, like loop start and loop end and marker select, they don't do anything in session view. I think that's really good workflow integration for both session and arrangement view. The one critique I have here is that this track scrub button, I'm just like rarely ever going to use that, I feel, especially in live performance. And I think that's going to come down to my overall assessment of this controller in general. I feel like the Launchkey and the launch products in general used to be a lot more performance based, but we're seeing actually more and more companies, not just Novation, shift their priorities from performance to being like multifunctional production workflow controllers. And I assume that just comes from their research of their market. More people want these like production workflow devices and less people are performing, which I think is kind of sad. I think we're losing a little bit of the performance aspect of some of these musical instruments, which is really, really important. Let me be clear, all is not at a loss here, but there's definitely choices like this first encoder being a scrub encoder that points to saying, we're thinking a lot about the workflow of the Launchkey Mini. We're not really thinking about performance implementation as much, or we're trying to do both. I'll say that. Let's not harp on that too long. With the encoders and the pads, we have custom modes available. So these custom modes 1, 2, 3, and 4 can all be customized with component software. Components has always been a super user-friendly way of customizing Novation gear, so you can do things for the encoders like change the CCs, MIDI channels, etc. I used these during the performance to change different performance effects, like an effect on my master, so that's just MIDI mapped. Now we're going to get on to talking about the pads, but I want to just quickly touch on the keys. The keys feel fine. They don't feel radically different from the Launchkey Mini Mark III. If you are very particular about your keys, I don't think you're going to be interested in a mini key keyboard. These keys are fine. Been using mini MIDI keyboards for a long time, and they're not bad. I don't have a religious experience when I play them, but they're good. Obviously, we have octave buttons here, pitch, and modulation strips here as well. They are strips on the Launchkey Mini. I know people don't really love pitch and mod strips versus wheels, but I do think with strips you do get this kind of like, you can do this natural sort of bending situation just by moving your finger like that. So it is one kind of cool thing about pitch strips. I don't find that I use them that often anyway. Curious to know if you're constantly using the pitch and mod strips or wheels on your device. Next, we're going to talk about the pads, and they have added some features that are probably the biggest improvement for the Launchkey Mini, including DAW mode, Polyphonic Aftertouch, and they've even got a step sequencer, the first step sequencer that acts the same way as Ableton Push. I'm going to tell you all about that, but first let me tell you about our sponsor, DistroKid. I chose DistroKid because it's easy to just pay one time a year and release as much music as you want. I can upload music right from my phone, I can edit my releases from my phone, and any money I've earned on DistroKid I can withdraw right from the app as well. And the other feature that I very much enjoy using for my releases is the Hyperfollow link. Basically a landing page that you can create for your music. It will automatically populate with your music on all the streaming sites, but you can add your own links to it. So I can add my Bandcamp link, and I can also even add those videos that I talked about, including my video for Hauntology, which was made with the Push 3, and my video for Nostalgiacore, which I went with other gear for. There's a bunch of other perks for DistroKid artists, but you can check out more of them at the website. The link is down below. That link will also get you 7% off your first year of DistroKid. So if you are looking to release music, I highly recommend DistroKid. They've been a great distributor for me, and I've never had literally any issues. And like I said, I've been using them since well before I even had this channel, really. So thank you once again to DistroKid for sponsoring this video. All right, so jumping in here on the pads, functions the same way as if we change encoder modes by like touching these pads here, and below we have the labels for what each pad mode is. So if we look at the first four, starting the first one on DAW mode. Now in DAW mode, it's what you'd expect. We can launch different clips. And let's say a track is armed, like this piano track is armed. I can record clips. 2, 3, 4. Very, very simple, right? Press play just to stop all that. So we can launch clips. We have 2 rows. So if this clip, for instance, is playing, I can stop this clip from playing. That'll all happen in time. And currently the piano track is armed. If I simply go to another track, there's an empty clip slot there, so I can stop it. But we've also got a second row of clips here where we can launch those clips as well. Now this track, for instance, has 2 clips, so there's no way for me to stop this clip from playing, right? Wrong. If I go to function, we get a few different functions for our second row. So this second row is now no longer session clips. Instead, they have different functions like stop. So these red pads indicate stop buttons now. Press function again. These are now like track mutes, track on and off. You can see those tracks turning on and turning off in Ableton Live. Press the function one more time and we get solo. So we can solo a specific track. No specific arm button here on the Launchkey Mini. I guess we have 2 different ways, like I explained earlier, of arming tracks by holding shift and scrolling through or using the encoder mode. But I do wish we had arm buttons because I find that very useful to just right away be like, I am arming the drums or I'm arming the piano specifically rather than having to scroll through this session. Recording works super intuitively as well. So if I press the record button, my selected track on my armed track, I should say, my selected clip slot will record. I can press record again to loop that back. I could have also just used the session record button. There's 2 different ways to go about it. But also, I can capture MIDI. So that means I can play some notes, press shift record, and what I just played was recorded without ever having to hit the record button first. I used that during the live session as well. Finally, when I tab over and go to arrangement view, even though we've been using record as a session record button before, it is smart enough so that when I'm in arrangement view, if I hit record, we now get arrangement record. A final cool thing about transport here is if I press play, obviously it will play the project. And if I stop that and I hit play again, it'll start playing from the beginning. However, if I hit shift play, it will continue playing from where we left off. So that's another convenient feature of the shift functionality in the transport control. And of course, we have the ability to launch scenes here as well. But that is one of two DAW modes we have here in Ableton Live. If I hold shift and press DAW again, we go into the sequencer mode. And like I mentioned earlier, this is the first controller that is not made by Ableton themselves, where it utilizes the step sequencer in the same way push does. Meaning, if I go over to our drum rack here and I use the keys to select a drum, I can now draw in notes on this track. So I got that 4 to the floor kick going. If I select a different instrument with the keys now, I can go ahead and step sequence all these notes. Now, what you've noticed if you're watching my screen here is that a new clip was created and those notes are being added to the clip. So if we take a look at that, let's add another note here. Those are getting added in real time here in Ableton Live. No other controller does this. I cannot stress this enough. Other than Ableton Push, no other controller works this way. Both the APC64 and the Launchpad Pro have step sequencers. However, they just send MIDI to your DAW that you then need to go through an extra step of printing that MIDI to a clip. So this is actually huge for the Launchkeys to have a step sequencer that works this way. Very, very welcome addition. And I'm so glad that whatever little negotiation Ableton and Novation got down to, so glad that it worked out. We do have a little more control over the individual steps in the step sequencer as well. If I press and hold on a step, you can watch in Ableton Live. You can see I can change the velocity. The velocity for that specific note is changing. I can change the note length from here as well. I can do a slightly more fine adjustment that's not snapping right to that grid. And then I can also do a nudge where I can move this note on the grid as well. The step sequencer also works for notes. So let's go over to this pluck synth. If I hold down a step and enter some notes, that chord will be printed there. So I can also just hold down a step and press a single note. So now we have both chords and notes being printed onto the step sequencer. If you notice, we've only been creating 1-bar loops. I can hold the function button here right now, and I can press the down button here, and that'll duplicate the clip so it becomes twice as long, and I can just keep doing that 4, 8, 16, etc. Also, I can do a little bit of navigating in the sequencer mode as well. I can press this button here, and then I can navigate to a specific MIDI clip that I might want to edit, or I might want to create. So the red LEDs here represent empty clip slots. So for instance, on my lead, I could just create a clip there, and then I could start putting notes. Very, very cool for a mini MIDI keyboard. Moving right along, we also have a drum mode, which is pads so we can play drums. Let's navigate back over to a drum rack. We have a whole drum rack here to play. We can scroll up and down the drum rack as well. And you can see that only pads with samples on them are illuminated. I've got these blank pads here, and that's because they have no samples on them. They've actually made quite a few awesome improvements on the chord modes on the Launchkey Mini. But first, this user chord mode. You can see that I've got a couple blue LEDs here when I go into this mode. Those are chords that I've already built and put in here. I'm going to go ahead and delete those actually by holding the function and just deleting them. Now this is blank. We have 16 pads, blank space for us to put our own chords. So what I'm going to do is hold down a pad and then play a chord. And if you can see the screen there, you can see that the chord name and the notes that I'm playing actually show up. When I release the pad, we've got that chord saved. So you can do any kind of chord. If you've got a specific chord voicing that you like, go ahead and hold that down. We don't have to hold down the notes. We can just play them one by one. G7 sus4, That is now saved. What's even cooler about this is we can now transpose those chords up or down. So if you have these chord voicings, like I said, that you really like, you're not just locked into using them in whatever key you played them in as, you can go and transpose them. Very, very good improvement here. You can build up your own progressions, fill up all these pads with your own custom user chords. Next, let's jump over to Chord Map. This is really, really interesting here. So as you can see, we've got 8 blue pads and 6 orange pads. And if I play one of the blue pads, we'll start to hear chords. And those might sound like very common chords, and that's because they are. What Novation have done is they've essentially assembled some common chord progressions under Chord Map. So here on the blue pads, you'll have common chords that you can play in a given key. This will also interact with scale mode. So if I go from C major to D major, these chords are now transposed to be in the key of D major. Now we've got 2 knobs here that are called Adventure and Explore. What those are going to do is they're going to give us different chord voicings and different collections of chord progressions. So as you go up with Adventure and up with Explore, the chord progressions might get more advanced and might push the boundaries of your given scale more and more. Let me turn those knobs a bit more and play on a piano sound. You can hear we've really pushed beyond our set key of D major, for sure, with this chord set. And this is interesting, but with these knobs being labeled Adventure and Explore, first of all, you have 5 settings for Adventure and 8 settings for Explore. And even in the user manual, it doesn't quite say what exactly those 2 parameters are tied to. I would have much more enjoyed a solid function that says like, hey, this one knob is going to adjust the voicings of the chord, and this knob here is going to push the intricacies of the chord. So you'd get more extensions or notes that aren't necessarily always in that given key. But instead we have Adventure and Explore. And like I said, there's 5 Adventure and 8 Explore. So they're calling that 8 times 5, 40 different chord sets. So the chord set at Adventure 1 and Explore 2 is different than the chord set at Adventure 4 and Explore 1, which we can definitely hear is true. Lots to explore there, but I'm looking for a concrete way to go, okay, I want to get to the key of D major, but with these kinds of chords. It's kind of just you have to find your own way through adventure and exploration, as they're calling it here. We have spread, which has 3 settings: normal, wide. You can hear that's actually adding a bass note, different from the previous, and then widest. You get a top note. So we get nice wide voicings, lots of notes across the keys. And then we have roll, which will increase by milliseconds and give us a rolled chord sound. Cool. Dial that back, set the spread to normal, and now let's talk about these orange pads, which we've ignored for the moment. These are called performance pads, and the way they work is I hold one down and then I play one of my chords, and that chord is performed in a certain kind of way. So you can hear that this one performance pad here is arpeggiating upwards through the chord. If I play this next one here, we're arpeggiating down through the chord. Next, we can play through inversions of the chord, up and down. Here, we play a bass note, then the chord, followed by, this plays the bottom half of the chord, followed by the top half. These can also be latched, so I can hold down one of these performance pads, press this button here, and now, so I can quickly play through these chords with that performance pad active. Pretty interesting approach and a way to get some interesting chord progressions. And some articulations that we previously haven't been able to play on like a single pad. It's a very, very cool thing they've done here, I think. So Chord Map is that final bespoke pad mode. We also have custom modes here. Now with custom modes on the pads, you get access to a few different things. Like you can have full scales here. This is set to a C minor scale. And these pads now have polyphonic aftertouch. So real quick, let me load up a drift instrument here in Ableton Live. And if I go to mod, I can set the pressure signal from the pads, and I can turn that up to 100%, and I can link that to, let's say, oscillator 1 shape. So that change is happening as I'm adding more pressure. Let me dial that down so it's more obvious. That change in sound is happening as a result of the pressure I'm applying to the pads, and it's happening per pad. So it's not like if I apply pressure on a single pad, it affects the whole thing. No, each pad, each note reacts to its own pressure. If I grab the MPE control effect in Ableton Live, even though this isn't quite MPE, it's just Aftertouch, we can see on pressure, we can see this coming in on pressure, and we can even adjust it here as well. Definitely a welcome addition and great for a mini MIDI keyboard to have polyphonic aftertouch on the pads. Very cool. Moving right along on these custom pads, this is just how it comes out of the box. So this is just another collection of notes that can be used for drums, followed by some CC switches. I use those during my performance to turn things on and off or to trigger some beat repeats. By default, these two rows are momentary and toggle, so you can use them as toggle switches on and off, or you can use them momentary, so I have to be pressing the pad for the effect to happen, which is actually how I program my beat repeats. You can see on screen, I can trigger that 16th note and 8th note just by pressing the pad, and when I release the pad, it turns off. Conversely, for the drums, I can turn my kick drum on and off with this switch here. And that's totally different because now it's on and now it's off. Two different behaviors, so pretty cool. This comes by default in Custom 3, but of course in Components you can configure this however you want. And Custom 4, I believe, is currently set to program changes, but it just goes to show that you can set any of these custom modes with both the pads and the encoders however you want. Now, I did allude to the scale mode earlier, and let's talk about that for a moment. So at the moment, I've got scale engaged, and I've set it to C major. That's fine if you know how to play in C major, but if you play notes out of key, we won't be able to play notes out of key. We can change our root note with this first knob here. So now we're playing the notes in E major, no matter what I play, and you can see a little display of the notes in that scale right there. So the first knob is for our root note, the second knob is for our mode or our scale, so we can go from E major to, say, E minor pentatonic. And we've got a lot of different scales and modes here to choose from. Third knob here is actually going to adjust how the keys react to you playing notes that are out of scale. So currently, by default, we were in snap to scale mode, meaning that any out of key note that I play will just play an in key note. If I change this to filter out of scale, if I play a note that's not in the key of E major, or whatever scale I'm set to, that note will not sound. Only in-key notes will sound, other notes will be muted. And finally, easy scale, which I think is really interesting. What easy scale does is it takes your scale and just puts it on the white keys. So right now I'm playing an E major scale, but I'm playing it as if it were a C major scale. So if you want to just play on the white keys, you can do that. Interesting implementation of scale mode for those of you that don't want to go too deep with music theory. Let's keep our scale mode engaged and talk about the arpeggiator because there's also some cool improvements there. So with ARP on, I can arpeggiate through notes. If I hold Shift in ARP, we will latch the ARP, meaning I don't have to hold down the keys. It'll just continue playing. We can adjust the BPM. You can also sync the BPM with your DAW or other gear. We can swing. We can change the rate. We can change the gate length, so going from longer notes to shorter notes. We can change the type, which is kind of like the direction, the movement of the arpeggiation. It can even be random. Up/down. We can change the octave, so we can play through more octaves than what we played. And then we can mutate, which is cool because suddenly we'll start to get notes that weren't exactly in the chord that we played. But if we take advantage of that with scale mode activated, I had to stop that chord for a minute. But if we take advantage of that with scale mode activated, even when it mutates through the chord, it will keep all notes in key with our scale mode. So it's a way to get more interesting arpeggiations, and you can really push it. So it's never quite the same every time. And the further you push it, the farther out it will go. So mutate is pretty cool for coming up with cool arpeggiations. You could use it to come up with cool melodies, etc. Next, we have Deviate, which will change the rhythm of our arpeggiation. So you can see this grid happening here, which is signaling like which notes are getting omitted across the rhythm. If I hold down the arpeggiator button, we actually get a grid here where we can change that ourselves. So you can see that all notes are being played in rhythm. Now it'll play this rhythm and arpeggiate through the chord as well. So that's really cool. I have 3 functions I can play with the arpeggiator in this screen here. I have tied notes. So I'm just going to take out some notes using the deviate function. I'm going to tie this note using this bottom row of pads. So you can hear the note is longer. It's tied to the next step. Hit the function button again and we have accent. We can accent different notes. And finally, we have ratchet, which will actually add a second note onto that step. So right now, our rate is set to 16th notes. If I set this to 8th notes, listen to the ratchet again. What the ratchet is doing is adding another note on the step, but it will always be double whatever the rate is of your arpeggiator on that step. So if we're playing 8th notes now, any ratcheted step will play that note as 16ths. Basically just doubles the rate on that given step. So definitely not your average arpeggiator. There's a lot of cool features here that make it really fun to play with and take it beyond, just arpeggiating up and down chords, doing stranger things over and over and over again. One last thing I left out. Under type, we have all the typical types of arpeggiation, like chord, but there's one really cool one called strum. I set it to strum, I play my chord. Oh no, there's no sound. But we can use the modulation strip to strum through the chord. Let's go with a little more inspiring sound here. And perhaps a bigger chord. So we can strum up and down the chords when we set to ARP to strum using the modulation strip, which I think is really cool as well. All right, folks, I think we've covered the basics of the new things in the new Launchkey Mini. I mean, we got a new size, we have a bunch of new features. Would love to hear what you think. Is there anything missing that you would have liked to see? Here's my final verdict where this sits with all the other MIDI controllers, especially as an Ableton Live user. I think Novation has continuously made pretty much the best mini MIDI keyboard for Ableton Live. They just really nail the integration. And there are many welcome improvements on this keyboard keyboard that we just went through. Number one for me is, of course, the step sequencer. Being the first controller that has a step sequencer that acts this way, other than push, is monumental for me, and I wanted to implement it right away, as you saw in my performance. From a production workflow standpoint, they've also got really cool stuff like being able to scan and scroll through the project and things like that. That's cool. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that some of the performance features from the Launchkey line are sort of becoming a second priority here for deeper workflow implementation, which is fine, and that's probably better for the majority of people. But maybe through components, I can come up with my own specific mappings and ways of interacting the controller that prioritize performance more. I still think it's good for performance. That's how I was able to put together that live looping performance. But there are some things that could be a little more convenient, like not having to use 2 buttons to scan through an ARM tracks or use an encoder. Having some specific ARM buttons would be great. Not having the track scrub button be the first encoder in DAW mode, putting that somewhere more towards the end. Things like that. And also endless encoders. People love endless encoders, but they're not ideal for performance because you want to be able to look at your encoder and see where it is. But the screen can help with that somewhat because you can hold shift and touch a knob and it will give you the value of that knob without actually changing it. But again, that's using like 2 buttons to do a very simple thing. I wish there was a quantize button. I wish there was an undo button. I know the larger sizes are going to have that. We've got a little bit of native instruments syndrome here. By that, I mean a MIDI keyboard with a bunch of blank space where they could have just put a couple more buttons. If you look at native instruments controllers, they have like a few buttons in the middle and they're like totally empty. I know it's not that simple, like, oh, there's space on the front. It has to do with what's on the inside. Little nitpicky things here that just come from the perspective of wanting to do more performing with these controllers. But not every controller has to be perfect at everything all of the time. And these new Launchkey Minis certainly are taking things to the next level. I still think this is probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest, mini MIDI keyboard for Ableton Live currently. And I know there's a bunch of other DAW integration out there too. So if you use another DAW out there, let me know what you think of this controller, how it's going to be working for your DAW. That's going to be it for now. Check the links in the description. When you support the sponsor, you support the channel. Thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video. Thank you to Novation for sending me this keyboard. And looking forward to what you all have to say in the comments down below. Shout out to the members. That's going to be all for now. This has been TAETRO. Have a good one.